Hello, it is time for Aggro Goose's, since we're trying to be slightly more work safe. Aggro Goose's opinions on technology while using the spinning wheel because lazy, I do not want to do this separately. What I'm spinning here is, I'm not even sure how this is pronounced in English. Ramie, ramie, R-A-M-I-E. It has a different name in Korean, which I am blanking on. It's a bast fiber, which I'm also probably mispronouncing, which means it's related to, if you've read the story of the princess and the swans who were her brothers, so stinging nettle, flax, milkweed, apparently you can spin milkweed, which I did not know. So we're going to be spinning, well, I talk about technology, specifically narrative as technology. I feel obliged to give you the disclaimer that this is not good spinning. This is certainly a spinning endeavor exists. I'm mainly spinning for the therapy value because it's soothing, because it lets me do something with my hands. I have nerve damage in my hands and feet, so this is kind of something I want to do while it is possible. And that means that I'm not attempting to do production spinning. I'm not attempting to, or I mean, it's not that efficiency or good technique don't matter, but in the learning process of anything, I've always had that thing where, you know, for a brief shining moment, I have delusions of, but I will do this for the very first time, having never done it before, but read a lot of books on it. And it'll turn out beautiful and perfect, and spoiler alert, it never turns out beautiful and perfect, period. But that's a separate problem. Regardless, like almost anything that's more complex than anything, there's a learning curve. So one deal with spinning is that you are working with, well, this does not show up. Yeah, you are dealing with natural materials, which means that they have certain properties. In this case, maybe a little hard to see, this wispy stuff, this fiber has a natural fiber length, which is, I guess, medium long-ish. It's not super long, but it's also not super short, and that affects the way you physically are able to spin it at a given tech level or skill level. And of course, for example, if you have wool or cotton floof or whatever it is you are spinning, because this is a natural material that comes from an animal who did not extrude it in a completely uniform, convenient fashion for your convenience, there's going to be variation even on the same animal. I do some hobbyist leather working, and when I got into that, well, leather working, the basic idea is you punch holes in a thing and you sew it together. There's obviously a lot more difficult and certainly a lot of craft and skill that goes into it. But if you're making a tiny little wallet, you punch holes in things, you cut them out, you sew them together. You can get into it at a very, very basic level. And what I found one of the biggest barriers to entry was simply the cost of leather, right? I mean, it's leather. And one of the other interesting things, of course, was reading up on the different areas of the animal. So what I did was I haunted sales. Why pay full price if you don't have to? I haunted sales on like C-grade cuts of double shoulders because, of course, the animal does not have uniform skin across its body, which means the leather you get from those different parts of the body have different thicknesses or ruggedness or what stretchiness, whatever, elasticity, I guess. As you can tell, I am a hobbyist. I am not deeply serious into leatherworking, but this was something I was able to ascertain even at a hobbyist reading casually about the topic. And fiber, of course, is very similar. I promise I'm winding around eventually to some kind of point. Fiber is very similar. So at a certain point, so for example, I have an ancestral fondness for silk. I'm Korean American, and in fact, my mother's parents started out as textile merchants, and I was not allowed to pet the silk until I was an adult, literally an adult. But the fibers that I grew up with as quote unquote luxury fibers were basically silk and maybe ramie, however you say it in English. And of course, my mom stands for natural fibers generally, and for her that would usually be something like cotton, because we don't grow sheep in South Korea, if you think about the geography involved. So wool and the kind of spinning tools that you get for wool just didn't happen there. My understanding is wool has to be rather expensively imported, which is why my mom went wild in Michael's in the, $5 cheap wool yarn aisle when we were living in Houston. But the point being, with any kind of material, almost anything that has more than a very, very rudimentary level of difficulty or complexity, there's a learning curve. And for example, going back to silk, I can mess around with wool, or I can mess around with bamboo fiber, or whatever other thing that is perhaps less wildly spendy than silk fiber. But at the end of the day, if I want to learn how to spin silk, because silk is a physical material with physical properties, I'm going to have to suck it up and try the silk. I'm going to have to suck it up and do the thing. And no amount of reading up on silk spinning or spinning wheels or anything is going to replace the fact that sooner or later I got to get myself some silk fiber in order to try spinning it, to learn how to spin silk. Going back to airplanes, fighter airplanes in the Great War, World War I, when I got into reading some of the Biggles fighter pilot / adventure spy books, and Biggles Learns to Fly, which is, of course, actually fairly traumatic because it's describing this young man dressed into piloting for, I guess, what later becomes the Royal Air Force? I'm not British. Regardless, he's learning how to be a fighter pilot in these early biplanes, and the fact that there's no one to tell them how to fighter pilot when the first people are doing fighter pilot. There isn't a body of knowledge other than, well, we put you in the airplane and we kind of make sure that you know how to make it go, and hopefully don't crash it too badly and die when you carry out this endeavor. And I remember thinking, I'd rather have the person who's actually flown the plane for 20 hours and read a book for 1 hour than the person who has read books on flying a plane for 20 hours and done the actual flying for 1 hour. And as we get to more complex or expensive or dangerous or forms of endeavor that simply aren't even able to be accessed without prerequisites, I'm an orchestration student, so scoring for actual orchestra is not something that normal people are able to afford to do on a regular basis, if at all. So in those cases, you might see, for instance, I really doubt you would just casually hand an F-22 fighter jet to a random person who has never flown before, because they probably, I can only imagine, I don't fly, I don't do any of that, I barely have an eyesight, so that's not a thing for me. But I would imagine a very large amount of training goes before you, with simulators. But is there a simulator for a silk? I don't think so. Or, I tried spinning bamboo, which was interesting. It was certainly educational. There are similarities. It's also a very slippery fiber. It's also a very long staple, long fiber. But it actually doesn't quite behave the same way as silk, and that's just sort of the price of entry. So bringing this back to writing, it used to be or maybe it still is. I'm no longer keeping track of whatever is going on and how to teach creative writing for science fiction writers discourse, because I've been publishing since I sold my first story, although it wasn't published until a couple years later in 1997. Yeah, sold it in 1997. So, like a great many writers who are certainly more skilled and venerable than I am, I've seen a lot of discourse go around, and after a while, it just becomes repetitive and boring. So maybe you'll find this repetitive and boring too, despite the novelty of having a spinning wheel going in the background. But it was at one point the standard advice, and probably based on an earlier career model, when the magazines, the print magazines, and especially the legacy of the pulp print magazines during the heyday of that age, used to be the standard recommendation was not to go directly to writing or attempting to write novels. You should do your time in the short stories and publish short stories and make a name for yourself. And that's how I spent 17 years. I spent 17 years writing and publishing short stories before coughing up and selling a novel. I had written. By the way, this quote, this knife is my most used spinning tool, a.k.a. wow, I done messed that up, let's cut ourselves free. So, at the time, I was getting into submitting stories and eventually selling one to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. The advice really was, do your time in the short stories, like maybe work on a novel if you absolutely must, but start with the short stories. Now there are some practical reasons to hone parts of your craft on a short story if that's what you want to do, even if your goal is novels. Inherently, a short story is shorter than a novel, which means that certain things can be practiced, and man, I'm gonna sound like a software engineer, which I'm not. Certain things can be practiced and iterated and learned more quickly on average because you're doing something that there's less of it. If you have a maximum rate of, I mean, for the sake of argument, I do know writers who write this fast, but usually not all the time. If you have a maximum rate of writing 10,000 words in a day, then inherently you could write one 10,000 word story, which I guess at that point is technically a novelette or something. You could write one of those every day. But if you have, I'll call it a 100,000 word novel, which is approximately a 400-page regular fiction novel, if you have something like that, then inherently with your maximum production rate, mathematically, you can only produce one of those every 10 days, assuming you never take vacations, which I also don't recommend, but that's a separate topic. So, there are things that you can more rapidly practice and iterate at short story length, and I think that's part of why we have that advice. If you're working on basic prose, if you're working on sentence construction, to a large degree, I don't think formatting is as much of a pain anymore. And I say this as someone whose first submissions were typed on a typewriter. So there are certain things that are not as annoying and difficult. And to a large degree, right now, if you're submitting to English language, American-ish markets, the formatting is really not that different in the broad strokes. I have to say, my first short story submission to anthologies in a semi-professional magazine, as the SFWA then classified it. My first submissions were in 5th grade, so rather obviously they were terrible as fiction, as works of anything, but by golly, they were correctly formatted for the little that matters. So when we think about practice, there are things you just can do more of, or you can write more short stories on average. And this is not to say that the short story is some kind of warm-up. it can be used as a form to warm up on elements of craft that short stories and novels have in common, like can you write a sentence? Can you make a description describe you? Which I'm not the one to talk about that. What can you do that is common to the two forms? I'm of the opinion that in some ways writing short, especially writing very short, is more difficult because being concise, if you sit there writing a bunch of words into a document, if you have the stubbornness and persistence and the health that permits you to do that, eventually you can get to 100,000 words of something. It may not be a very good something, but you know, it's 100,000 words of something. But it's much easier to overlook certain kinds of flaws in prose or construction when your book is 400 gazillion pages long. It's a lot harder if it's a 100-word piece of flash fiction or a drabble, I guess one would say, coming from fan fiction, or if it's a haiku. Imagine getting 3 words wrong in a haiku. That haiku is sunk. It's no longer functionally a credible haiku. You get 3 words that wrong in the gazillion page, I don't know, 800-page novel at the limits of what we can comfortably bind with machines, and someone's probably going to notice, and a bunch of people probably didn't even read that sentence while they were skimming for the next chapter that has their favorite character as a point of view. You know what I mean? So I don't say that one length format is better or worse than another. Keeping in mind, I don't really like talking about literary quality because nobody has coughed up a universal agreement on that. And I don't say one is quote-unquote easier or harder unless you are looking at a specific axis, an axis of time, an axis of certain types of complexity, an axis of what a given writer more comfortably writes. It is my curse that I more comfortably write short stories, but we're no longer in the golden day and age of the pulps when you could make an actual living by writing only short stories. So here I am with the occasional novel. So it's not a question of easier or better in a global sense, because that's highly individual to the writer. I know writers who are unable to think in anything shorter than a trilogy, and preferably a 5-book series. I know writers who struggle to produce something longer than a few thousand words of story, and the people I'm thinking of here are all excellent writers. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. Some of us have more weaknesses than others. God knows I have a lot of weaknesses, but one of the things that is a little deceptive here, of course, is that there are aspects, if your goal is novels specifically, there are things that writing a gazillion short stories will never ever teach you about writing a novel with whatever degree of success, however you measure success, whatever aim you are attempting to achieve in that novel. You can't get it from a short story. It's kind of like spinning a bunch of cotton, and it will give you some of the skills that apply towards spinning silk, but it's not going to give you the actual facts experience of spinning silk. Certain kinds of anything to do with structure. Let's start with structure. So a short story inherently is, because of its length, is constrained in how much it can shovel in there. I think for a simpler example, let's just talk about character and point of view. So inherently, all other things being equal, which is a highly vexed statement, I realize, you can fit more-ish character arc into a novel because you simply have more space to do so. You can do more of, you can devote more words. The words are the thing that we can measure versus, I mean, we can have a novel like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which literally, as far as I recall from high school, the entire novel and it's a short novel, but it's still a novel. The entire novel is one day, and we can have short stories or shorter works that span the lifespan of galaxies. For science fiction, the example that immediately comes to mind is the story, probably novella or novelette, the story version of Poul Anderson's Tau Zero, which I think succeeds better at the longer novel length version because you get the logarithmic presentation of the passage of time. It has more space to breathe, but regardless, on average, you can devote more words to a character arc in a novel than you have in a short story because the space is there. And if you look at the kind of word count, the kind of depth, again, using word count as a very poor proxy for complexity or depth. Goodness knows, I have certainly written novels where there's not really all that much there in character development, and that can be a thing. That can even be a design feature. But regardless, it's not a really good proxy, but short of coming up with some way to measure how much character arc we have in XYZ, that's what we're left at. The novel will have more of it. If you want to show the rise and fall of some protagonist across a 5-book saga, you inherently cannot produce the same word count experience that you can in a 2,000-word short story. And you get this sometimes when people talk about point of view and main characters versus side characters versus ensemble casts in a novel that significantly features more than one character of interest. Again, because word count is a really terrible proxy, but it's sort of an objective measure that we can gesture at. You have a book with, 120,000 words is easier to divvy up. You have a 120,000 word novel. You have one point of view character or protagonist or narrator, and these things are all orthogonal, but for the sake of simplicity, you have one main character carrying that novel for 120,000 words. You are probably, on average, going to be able to get more depth out of that character than if you have 4 characters. Now, each character, on average, realizing that books don't necessarily divvy the stuff up evenly, on average, each character is getting 30,000 words of page time, or word count time? It's not even a word. Of word count. They're getting 30,000 words because 120,000 words divided by 4 characters gives us 30,000. And we're no longer able to have as much word count as a proxy for character development / detail / depth. We can't have as much as 120,000 words. It's math. And I realize I keep saying this because I think someone is going to fail to understand that this is a proxy. This is not some kind of precise measurement of how much character arc. Speaking as someone who used to teach high school math, it's just very difficult to convey some of this information in a way such that nuances don't get lost, especially over the internet. People would never argue on the internet. I have no idea where that would ever happen. So getting back to narrative as technology, I have here a piece of technology which you can only see part of because this iPad camera does. I don't have a good videography setup, which is probably fine for the 3 people who are watching this. So the spinning wheel, for instance, I may or may not have discussed it before, but this was designed probably, or descended from spinning wheels that were designed for spinning wool. So you have this brake band, which connects the wheel to the flyer. The flyer has a brake band. There's this thing that lets you adjust the angle so it stretches the band so they have more tension. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts is what I'm saying, because you can make all these different adjustments to the wheel to change how it spins and to change how it spins so that you can accommodate different spinning techniques, different, whether that's something on your end you want to spin in a particular way, or whether it's due to the fiber. If the fiber has particular properties, like a very long or short staple length, or it's super slippery or it's not slippery, or it's something like flax, which apparently flax normally is full of pectin. I think I mentioned this at some past point. And I'm pretty sure the toe flax that I have attempted spinning does not have pectin in it, because I've been wet spinning. If you see me dipping my fingers in this water, bast fibers, this family of plant fibers, they get stronger when they're wet, and they tend to be long and have, like, little flyway fibery bits sticking out, so water just kind of helps contain that. That is the theory. I'm certainly not an expert. So we have this wheel as a technology, and it's kind of wild to me thinking in terms of what is available now when you walk into, I don't know, a Target or a craft store or anywhere where you can get cheap cotton polyester thread or mercerized cotton for a few bucks, and this is completely normal. You don't have to spin it yourself. You don't have to produce or process XYZ fiber. You can rely, because this is now machine-made thread, you can rely on the fiber being pretty uniform in a way. I don't know if you can tell, make my sleep. My fiber is extremely yeah, that's just awkward. Its width, its thickness is not consistent because I'm still learning to do this. And so that's kind of mortifying, but it is the learning process. And again, I'm not production spinning, I'm spinning as a personal enjoyment activity. As I adjust the wheel again. But if you think about it, stories are also a kind of technology, and I'm using technology in a very broad sense. If you think about story as a vehicle for the transmission of lessons, whether it's Aesop's fables or the Tao Te Ching, which I'm probably mispronouncing. I'm probably mispronouncing Aesop for that matter. Whether you're looking to story for models of behavior, for models of story, models of problem solving, models of how the world ought to be, an orientation toward the world, an orientation of understanding, of moral anything, of, any kind of allegory. And if you look, I'm now kind of talking out of my Aggro Goose, because I'm not a folklorist. I'm not an anthropologist or a narratologist or sociologist. I am sitting on a not very profitably or not very productively used math degree. So I welcome correction from the anthropologists in the chat hypothetical. If you look at the origins of story, which presumably existed before the development and spread of various writing systems, then we're looking at oral tradition, and a lot of the techniques we see in prose that seem sometimes atavistic make a lot more sense when you look at it from the lens of an oral tradition. A lot of the techniques that survive in, say, poetry or rap, you can look at them as artifacts of an oral transmission process where those techniques, the way that you organize your words, helps make them memorable so that they can be transmitted. Like, inherently, if you can't remember it, it's probably gonna not get transmitted to the next person in the next village over, or at the next, I don't know, when you gather at your tavern telling tall tales. Not that a Texan would ever know anything about tall tales. So all these poetic devices, such as alliteration, rhyme, assonance, counting syllables, techniques of imagery, where you have parallel construction of imagery or metaphor, all the rhetorical techniques that you can find. I don't think rhetoric is even really generally taught in American schools anymore. I only came across it en passant while reading up on linguistics for science fiction reasons. But all these different things like ad hominem attack, all these categorizations, there's this really delightful list of A to Z Greek rhetorical technique names from, I don't know, ad hominem to zeugma, which I'm probably also mispronouncing, because that was a point in time when those techniques, I assume, would have been in active use either by the Greeks or the Romans or whoever. Thinking of Cicero endlessly going on about Carthago delenda as Carthage must be destroyed, and repetition as a structuring device to help us remember, because I don't know about you, but I have goldfish brain, so if you want me to remember a thing, you probably have to run it by me a couple times, and I imagine I'm not the only one with goldfish brain, sadly. Especially in a place and time where you don't have MP3 players or Wikipedia or books necessarily, or maybe you have cuneiform tablets, but I have to imagine that cuneiform tablets are a little more unwieldy as a recording device and possibly a little less accessible. What was the literacy rate in ancient Sumer or among the Hittites or the Assyrians? I mean, again, I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist or a historian, but one thinks about these things in technology. And when we come to narrative and technology, there are a lot of conventions of the modern novel versus older novels, and here I'm going to restrict the discussion to the English language since that's the only one I read fluently. I was a little better at French once, but I haven't read extensively in French, so I'm really referring to the English language-ish tradition and or stuff translated out of it. I mean, I read the obligatory Shakespeare back in high school, but of course there were lots of footnotes. I read Spenser's gigantic poem, The Fairy Queen, again, lots of footnotes. Actually, my favorite Tolkien, which this is probably heretical to admit, especially since I know some science fiction and fantasy writers, my favorite Tolkien work has nothing to do with Middle-earth. It's his translation of, I think, the Old English or maybe Middle English. Can you tell I didn't major in English? Of the old poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He did a translation of it, and I liked it, or it's my favorite thing by him. Perhaps because I had some passing familiarity with Arthuriana, so it was a little easier to make heads or tails out of. But when you look at some of the, let's say, deprecated, some of these narrative techniques or conventions that are deprecated, and you think back to the history of human communication, of humans having history or information sharing, when you think of the famous story of the victory at Marathon and getting the news, and you kind of have to ask yourself, I mean, sure, some runner came by and said that this happened and was believed. Presumably, enough people knew that the runner was reliable or his family was reliable. I mean, I actually don't know. I don't know a lot about that area of classics history. It's not like they can turn on a television or go to a social media site like, I don't know, TikTok or YouTube or Blue Sky or whatever it is these days, and check what other people are saying about it. They don't have that. They have to rely on, well, do I trust this person? If you're a random peasant in what is now France, say, and you hear some passing minstrel or troubadour or trader or whatever, or whoever, if you hear some passing person tell you, it's 7:32, I don't know that much about calendar systems in that time and place in Europe, which is also ironic, but for the sake of argument, it's 7:32 or close to 7:32, and Charles Martel has driven back the Islamic presence in, I think it was Spain, or what is now Spain, and at the Battle of Tours. I think it was the Battle of Tours. I'm waiting for the medievalists to shank me now because I'm not a medievalist. And so possibly you're a peasant and maybe you've never traveled more than 2 or 3 days away from your home, farm, village, croft, whatever, because you have farming to do, you have work to do, you don't have the internet, you don't have a television, you don't know people 500 miles away. Possibly you have no idea what 500 miles away looks like. I mean, I'm sitting here in the modern United States of America in Louisiana, and I have to tell you, other than heading up to Texas, I don't know what it looks like as I drive out 500 miles towards Atlanta, Georgia. I haven't made that drive. I literally don't know. And of course, I can hop onto the internet and have some online map tell me. But if I'm that hypothetical medieval French, or what is now France, peasant, I don't know that I have that information. And anything that I hear from a traveler, well, is the traveler someone who comes by every year or every 3 years? Are they someone I trust? What do I know about this traveler? Or are they making up something, a fun story, so they can be bought free drinks at the bar? I assume there were bars. Bar or tavern. I mean, how do you know? What is the provenance of the story? There are languages, and I wish I still had my linguistics textbooks, Flood Casualties. There are languages where you have grammatical ways, systematic grammatical ways to indicate something called evidentiality, which is how reliable is this information? How do I know this is true? So, for sake of argument, not necessarily an actual example, because again, my linguistic books didn't survive the flood, I could have some way of indicating with some grammatical marker that I know this, that I am telling you about, I know this happened because I witnessed it myself. I was there, or I did the thing, or I was involved in doing the thing. I could have a marker that says, oh, I didn't do this, but someone I talked to told me about it, and they're a member of my family, or there's someone I otherwise know to be reliable. So now, of course, you're vouching for someone in this hypothetical game of telephone. So you have this idea of evidentiality. How much can I trust this account? Where does this information come from? Is the source of this information or divine revelation or prophecy or anything along those lines, is this something that I can believe in and trust? There is some gesture towards where does this information come from, that I can know, that I can rely on it, which I guess brings us to science fiction and fantasy, because certainly I have complained a lot, actually. I've complained rather a lot about prologues in science fiction fantasy, which remain in fashion in certain genres. I think I've seen a complaint that they're very common in lit RPG or C novels, web novels that come out of East Asia, for instance. I'm not deeply read in that area, so I'll let someone else comment on that. But you have an idea of provenance, the setup of this world, what is the history of this world, and of course, to a modern reader, a lot of that looks like, oh, it's boring, it's a waste of time. And I wonder, as someone who's not an English major or a narratologist or a folklorist, there probably was a point in time when that seemed like a functional way to start a story, because, you know, someone's telling, you're at your games club for D&D, and you're all referring to that in-jokey thing about, actual example, the time your family played a fantasy role-playing game, and your daughter is 8 years old, so obviously, you know, not expected to be super participatory, and there's a fight with a spider in true dungeon crawling fashion, so my husband and I, in this RPG run by my sister, we fight off the spider, 8-year-old daughter, who's playing the thief, actually. 8-year-old daughter, the first thing she does, which actually is good instincts, like I would urge her to do this in real life. Giant spiders, she runs, she's squishy, she just runs, she leaves. Then after the battle, she comes back, and her character, the thief who ran away from the battle, is like, so was the loot any good? And so now in my family, and possibly any the 2.3 people who are watching this YouTube video for whatever reasons of your own, we now have this thing where, so was the loot any good? And we don't need to reference the whole story because everyone in the conversation was there. We know where that story came from and what it means and why it's funny. But when you're inventing a whole new world, it's not based on, I don't know, the village you lived in or the people you grew up with. You have to set the scene. You have to create this world for your audience. And you have to establish some kind of credibility. No, this is the way it really was. One thing I've found really interesting is I've seen epistolary formats come in and out in science fiction and fantasy because that's my main area of concern professionally. And I feel like this is the part where I really would like to ask someone who has studied English literature. I feel like epistolary format fiction used to be a more going thing than it is now. Because, again, it establishes some sort of provenance, even if it is fictive provenance. XYZ expedition to Antarctica or some frozen liquid, I guess it's not liquid if it's frozen, some frozen methane ocean on another planet, but you have these fictive records that simulate the experience of archival, of record keeping, and we're not even getting into historiography and the whole thing where just because somebody wrote it down in a 3,000-year-old record doesn't mean that they intended to tell the truth knowingly or not. So I think as we get to a more modern readership who will say, well, of course it happened this way, the convention, unless we're in unreliable narrator land, is that we can rely on some kind of narration to set the scene in a way that we find satisfying and plausible and not have to bother with the now extraneous, because the convention has changed, the now extraneous need for, or the now extraneous formatting with, well, here are a bunch of documents and letters. And again, you do see epistolary and document-based narrative, fictive documents. You do see that surviving, but it's not necessarily the major or only mode. My favorite example of this is actually from a poem, and it's Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I did read that as a kid, sort of in the educational way, but I became more interested in it because of a science fiction novel, which is kind of obscure, I think, Robert Silverberg's Face of the Waters, and I remember reading it and going, wait, this is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, except I guess technically in space. It's on an alien planet. It talks about, it sort of translates the whole scenario to an alien contact / survival story, which I enjoyed. I think it's very cleverly done, and I mean, this is not accidental because Silverberg explicitly quotes Coleridge in that book. There's that whole bit about water everywhere, nor any drop to drink when they're becalmed and kind of not doing well. But if you recall, either at the beginning or toward the beginning of the poem, there is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three, something, 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 wherefore stopp'st thou me. And I think the mariner kind of drops out of the story after making his introductory spiel of, hey, this thing happened to me, would you believe that, XYZ? I don't remember, or maybe he is the implicit narrator, maybe he's implicitly the main character of the story, and the person, his interlocutor, is the one who's relating it to us after getting it from him. I actually need to reread that. But that is an example of, hey, here's where the story comes from, and you can or should, for the space of this poem, for the space of this telling, you can believe me because of XYZ. And now, of course, we have very savvy modern readers who take that for granted because we live in an economy where those stories are things that are all around us, that you read in school, that you learn to read in school, that you consume on the television or on YouTube or whatever it is. I guess I might compare it to, again, interfaces in video games where, yes, now we have tooltips and helpful arrows telling us which way the next quest object is. We're usually not sitting there with literal graph paper and a pencil mapping the topography, the fictive topography of a game, which is something that I've done and something I've known other people to have done back from that era. But at the same time, there are a lot of interface elements that are, for example, graphical user interface elements where we have an iconography that has passed into what is assumed to be common knowledge. And I think the funny example of this is the file save icon, which is usually based on a 3.5 inch or a 5.25 inch floppy disk. And I'm talking to my daughter, who is a college student and has never ever seen a floppy disk in her life, although she is, she's studying computer science, so certainly more knowledgeable generally on comp sci than I am, but she's never seen a floppy disk. She just knows that that's the weird icon thing that means file save. One reason this comes back to story for me is that story is, in some sense, about abstraction when it's teaching. And I have complained about this before, and no doubt will complain about it again. One thing that is, I'm going to call it fashionable. One thing that's fashionable right now in science fiction and fantasy is an attachment, a fetish, sort of almost a fetish, I would call it, for mimesis, for making the world building realistic, for making it plausible, whatever we conceive of plausibility or realism to be. And I call it a fetish because I don't think it's as self-evident as people think that this is a way that fiction, quote-unquote, should be aesthetically. I don't think that is self-evident. It's kind of like the time when, many years ago, I started watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer back when Netflix sent out physical DVDs. And I remember someone telling me that, no, TV's so easy, like, you don't have to learn how to watch TV. And I'm someone who, I grew up watching surprisingly little TV, which my media composition program teases me about, because I get migraines. So there was a very hard limit to how much TV I was ever going to be able to watch. Even when I was living with my parents as a kid, I usually would not watch more than an hour of TV tops. I usually avoided movies because the longer it was, the bigger the screen, the sort of the likelier it is that I'm going to have migraine issues. So my realization is that, not that this person is necessarily wrong. I think many people learn the protocols of cinematography in this case, American or American-ish TV, because they learn it young enough that it's not obvious to them that they have done the learning. It's like my husband, who learned how to swim when he was like 6 or 4. He was very young, so he can't explain swimming because, like, it's just the thing, you get in the water and you do it. I, on the other hand, am a completely terrible swimmer, but he can't tell me how he does what he does because it was so long ago and it's now so instinctive that he doesn't have to think about it. So when we look at mimesis, I think people often think that, of course, a story should strive for some kind of plausibility or realism or consistency in a mimetic sense. And I'm not sure that's the case, but also this is a non-popular opinion, so you know, if you're about to talk to a literary agent or an editor, please listen to them. I am just one random person with unhinged opinions. I think I know I've talked in the past elsewhere about how there are models of story that do not rely on mimetic exactitude, and you can find historical examples. Paul Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, I'm afraid, because I'm American and Western literature, a lot of this is going to be Christian in nature, but for example, The Pilgrim's Progress, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, these are not mimetic, but you can also look at somewhat non-Christian examples that don't attempt to be quote-unquote realistic, to be mimetic in that way. E.R. Edison's The Warm Ouroboros, which I'm also I need to just sit down and look up a bunch of words, but there are so many words. And that explicitly, in this sort of like proto-isekai, it explicitly name checks Njal Saga, and the kind of fantasy that we have there is not based on the same kind of stratified, deep time world building as Tolkien's approximately, I think, or maybe even just plain contemporaneous work in Lord of the Rings in Middle Earth. If you look at works where the symbol system, the structure is based on metaphor, and maybe drama is a good place to look at this. If you have a shadow play, an Indonesian shadow play, the puppets are not mimetic in the sense of looking literally like three-dimensional people. If you look at Punch and Judy and character archetypes, so these are models of storytelling that don't rely on the same mimetic affect for their intended effect. And I don't know that this is a better or worse way, it's a different way. But when we think about the function of story in order to transmit, to communicate, to send a message, or show us how to prevail, or give hope, or give despair. Incidentally, I need to finish reading Peter Watts's Blind Side, and I have no idea why people think... I guess that book is kind of depressing. I still have not finished it. But at the point where the main character has had a hemispherectomy, and there's all these liminal in-between things going on by halves, and the name of their spaceship is Theseus. I just lost it. I cracked up so hard. That was the funniest name you can ever give to a ship in a philosophically oriented book, however nihilistic. So anytime you have story as a vehicle for how do you survive when you go through tough times, or your girlfriend, boyfriend, other friend, dragon friend leaves you, or you've been drummed out of the army, or I don't know, you have to destroy an evil ring because Sauron reasons. All of these problems are not problems that, on average, we experience exactly granularly, especially in science fiction and fantasy. We don't experience those problems in the exact same way that, or I would hope that nobody is sitting around with one brain going, oh, well, crap, how do I get this to Mount Doom? I'm hoping that's not a problem anybody listening to this has in an actual real world sense, but what do I know? The world's a very big place. So, in general, when we think about the quote-unquote lessons, the lecture lessons of it all, from a story, they're not usually conveyed in a one-to-one correspondence, completely, granularly mimetic sense. And I don't think this is a weakness of that kind of story. I don't think this is a weakness of metaphor or symbol or semiotics or any of that. I think it can... There are times when a mimetic presentation you know, if you're writing about an expedition to Antarctica and one of your goals is not to do some pulpy Lovecraftian thriller or horror story, but you do want to represent that with an eye towards what really has happened or does happen, then yes, that's an aesthetic choice that you can make, and that makes sense for the use case. But not every story does that. Not every story has to do that. And again, going back to hoping that nobody here really has the One Ring and is dealing with the Mount Doom problem. One of the things that makes story powerful is the fact that it isn't in one-to-one correspondence with the real world. I mean, just pragmatically, that would get really depressing. I'm sure a lot of writer households have the conversation of, yes, if my story came to life, my characters would shank me because I make them so unhappy. I'm guessing that the romance authors have it better because, you know, their characters get a happy ending. That's kind of one of the genre expectations. I, on the other hand, have a habit of being really terrible to my characters, so, you know, the worlds that I create are worlds that I don't want to live in the real life, that no one in their right mind really would want to live in. And it is that thing that sometimes when you have a model of an event or a process or an object even, sometimes it is the model's infidelity to reality that makes it more powerful and that makes it more useful. And this sounds paradoxical. If you wanted to model something, why would you not make it as accurate as possible? And really one of the simplest examples is the map, like a regular map, a road map, an atlas. If you have a map of Australia, and it is an exact reproduction of Australia, all the way down to every, you know, I've never been to Australia, all the way down to every rock and hill and tectonic plate and scale, that's no longer a map. It is a foxing duplicate. It's a duplicate. You can't carry it in your car, I assume, unless you have a very large car. What I'm saying is that the fact that the map has an area of necessary infidelity to reality, an area in which it is not faithful to the original, makes it useful. Sometimes it's, you know, sometimes it's just literally, if we're making a computer game about D-Day, do we have the processing power to simulate every single ship and the interface design that will present it to this hypothetical game player of a more or less historically based strategy game? Is that really going to serve the purpose of the game if I simulate every cup of coffee that was drunk on the morning of D-Day, which, you know, I need to start picking examples I know more about because I don't know if they were issued coffee on the morning of D-Day, but for the sake of argument, probably there was a beverage somewhere, there was a canteen somewhere in there. Is it actually going to help the game be a more fun experience, or even one that communicates whatever historical message, if any, not all games have that as a name, is it going to help to put all the cups of coffee drunk? I mean, I'm sure if there was coffee the morning of D-Day, probably it had some measurable effect on the people who did or did not partake of it. But is that now, absent somebody's probably very cursed graduate thesis, is that the most important thing to understand in our model of D-Day, in our game model? Is that the thing that we want the player or the consumer, the audience, to spend their brain cells on? Because as humans, we sadly, maybe a good thing, but as humans, we have a finite amount of attention for anything. We have a finite amount of, well, I'm sure it's not literally brain cells, and I'm not a neurobiologist either, but we have a finite amount of resources, mental resources to understanding anything. So in many cases, you want to leave out what is less important so that you can work towards building a better understanding of the elements that are really, really important. And going back to technology, so maybe you don't, you're faced with your hypothetical Mount Doom adjacent scenario in real life. I mean, I hope not, but for the sake of argument. And you're reading Lord of the Rings, and so I don't know, your adventuring party doesn't have Aragorn doesn't have Aragorn or Legolas, or there isn't a Golem, but there are probably parts that you can abstract out of the presented situation that may yet apply to your situation, even though it differs in the granular details. I mean, this is the power of abstraction, and I feel strongly about abstraction because it is perhaps the core. It is the core point of mathematics, is abstraction of pattern and structure. And so you might be able to say, well, I don't have Legolas or Gimli or any of the Fellowship people whose names that I am blanking on because it's been a long time. But I see that by the power of teamwork, by the power of teamwork, working together makes this easier to hit whatever my equivalent of Mount Doom. So you can abstract out a pattern. And now the fact that it's Mount Doom specifically may not be as relevant, but you can abstract out the part that is relevant to your specific, not literally Mount Doom and not literally One Ring situation. Going back to, say, history of math, you see this. If you look at a lot of older texts, older sources on mathematics, you see this. You might see that instead of, let's take the area of a rectangle, right, length times width, most people are able to learn that in elementary school at some point. But you see early texts, and usually, they get past rectangles pretty quickly, but just as something that's easier to remember. They'll sit there working out how to get the specific area of a specific rectangle. And then eventually you get to, oh, actually, all rectangles can be abstracted out to this formula of length times width. And rectangle sounds trivial, but when you start getting to weirdo geometric constructions, essentially you're getting to calculus and similar mathematical techniques in order to be able to say, well, here's a plot of land that is blob-shaped. How do I find the area without literally sitting there with a grid and approximating it out? And of course, you do develop numerical methods and so on. And you see this as well in something like art, where one of the first skills they teach you, for those who are able to draw much better than I do, I'm really very much a hobbyist. The first thing they teach you to do is to accurately draw what it is you see, whether that's in a reference photo. I mean, these aren't photos, these are artworks or reproduction artworks. But you learn to accurately, you learn the hand-eye because it is a physical skill at that point. That if I'm trying to draw a circle, that the circle that I produce with my pencil or brush or whatever tool I'm using, my stylus, is accurately, more or less, the circle I intended to draw, and then I can accurately reproduce something from that source. So at some point, I learned to accurately reproduce, I don't know, some Instagram girl, a photo of a human, and I can draw that specific human. But of course, most people who are interested in doing creative art, in doing portraits, want to be able to, or maybe not most, but a lot of people want to be able to draw more than one face. They want to be able to take that photograph and flatter it, or use it as the basis for their own character design, or to draw from imagination, to invent a face within whatever parameters we think of face are essential to a face. And now you're abstracting out, what are the general principles, what is the general shape of a head, what can we do to organize our understanding of the human head? I say, as someone who, again, is very mid at art, the proportions that look more or less correct? How can we diverge from these sort of template abstract proportions in order to get a specific type of face, a Disney princess face, an angry Oni demon face? And again, you see this in art, you see this in mathematics, you see this in music. If you know, music theory gets into this, and certainly it's not a prerequisite for composing music, but you might start with the key of C, and then you learn that there are certain intervals, and you can sort of go from, well, I only know how to write music into the key of C, to now I know how to write in any major key. C is a major key, and you can sort of build out from there. And so stories are kind of like that. And bringing this back to the vexed question of mimesis, sometimes mimesis is a fashion choice, or it serves whatever function of the story, but sometimes mimesis is besides the point. And I mean, again, as someone who writes largely non-mimetic, very science fantasy fiction, obviously I have an agenda. It's not that I don't enjoy fiction or games that have an emphasis on mimesis as an aesthetic choice, but I really always want to be aware that it is a choice, and it's not the only choice available, and it may not necessarily, depending on your use case, it may not necessarily be the best tool for whatever the heck your job is. I mean, I'm spinning something that is kind of like flax, since there are related fiber types. I'm spinning this on a wheel that is quote-unquote designed for wool. And, well, ironically, I'm really terrible at spinning wool. They say Corriedale is the easiest kind, and it makes me cry, so who knows what I'm doing wrong or differently. But this tool was designed for one thing, and it can be suborned for another, because this is the spinning wheel I happen to own. But in writing, in storytelling, I always want to be asking myself, what is the use case? What am I trying to convey? What is important to the story? What is functional? What is load bearing, for lack of a better word? For example, I certainly have kvetched about science fiction romances where, let's say that none of the military anything looked remotely plausible, even to me as a random civilian. But for that audience, that doesn't necessarily matter. They're not there for a granular description of, I don't know, parade ground procedure. They are there for the smooching. And so certainly one could, hypothetically, have, you know, this thing where in spinning you end up with fiber sticking to everything. That's certainly something I have never experienced. You can have something that's very, very mimetic, or that has a higher degree of quote-unquote realism. You can have that as a choice, but for that genre, for that audience, it may be completely besides the foxing point. It's kind of embarrassing to be using the word foxing because I'm trying not to cuss up a blue streak. I am very cussy in real life, but anyway. So, of course, one of the skills that comes into play when you're writing commercially, I should specify, or writing for a specific audience, is determining what it is that audience is really there for. I saw an interesting discussion of hockey romance, which I didn't even realize was a thing, but I'm also the one who went to Cornell and did not attend a single Big Red hockey game, so, you know, what do I know? Someone pointed out that the point of a hockey romance is not a granular representation of what guys in hockey and the locker room smells or whatever it is really actually are like. That's not the fantasy. That's not what people are there for. They are there for, I assume, the romance of it all, the fantasy of it all. And not everyone locates fantasy, not everyone locates wish fulfillment in the same way or in the same place, and that's kind of the human condition, that we don't always agree on what makes a story compelling, which is why it's good to have an ecosystem of many different stories out there so that hopefully everyone can find something that speaks to them. But of course, at the point of commercial writing, Some types of stories probably do have a larger, as measured in sales units. Some will probably have a larger audience or find it easier to find their audience. Yeah, and I think that is enough blathering since this fiber has gotten away from me and I actually have some work to do. So, yep. Aggro Goose opinions. It would help if I had a Goose prop, but that's a problem for future Yoon, who really does not like present Yoon. That's all. Ta.